from San Francisco, and a friend of mine flew on a plane. He was on the plane, and I guess it was.
He could walk onto a stage with nothing prepared and leave thousands of people crying with laughter. A mind so fast it felt supernatural. A voice that never slowed down. To the world, Robin Williams looked like joy in human form. But what if that joy was a performance? What if laughter wasn't happiness, but armor? In his final years, the jokes stopped working. Not because he lost his talent, but because the darkness he was facing wasn't emotional anymore. It was neurological. His own mind, once his greatest gift, was slowly turning against him. So how does a man who helped millions survive their darkest days end up trapped in a battle he couldn't outrun, inside his own head? To understand what happened next, you have to understand the contradiction at the center of his life. On camera and on stage, he moved like electricity, thoughts firing faster than language, jokes stacking on top of jokes, improvisation so sharp it felt almost inhuman. Audiences didn't just laugh, they felt lifted, rescued, reminded that the world could still be light. He wasn't simply funny, he was relief, and that's why almost no one noticed the cost. Because when someone becomes the emotional oxygen for millions of people, there's an unspoken rule. They don't get to run out of air themselves. Every interview, every appearance, every performance demanded the same thing: energy, warmth, speed, generosity. The show had to go on, not because anyone forced it to, but because that was the role the world assigned him. Be the funny one, be the comforting one, be the man who turns pain into laughter. But that role came with a quiet pressure. The faster his mind moved, the harder it was to slow it down. The louder the laughter became, the more silence waited for him afterward. Fame didn't calm his thoughts, it amplified them. Success didn't bring rest, it raised expectations. And over time, the distance between who he appeared to be and how he felt grew wider and wider. For years, people framed his struggle in simple terms: depression, addiction, burnout, the familiar narrative of a tortured genius. But that explanation never fully fit, because what was happening to him wasn't linear. Some days he felt sharp, present, alive. Other days he felt lost inside his own routines, anxious for no clear reason, unable to trust his instincts. His sleep fractured, his confidence eroded. The man known for absolute control on stage began to fear unpredictability in his own mind. That fear is important, because for someone whose entire identity was built on mental speed, memory, and emotional intuition, the slightest cognitive uncertainty isn't just uncomfortable, it's terrifying. Imagine realizing that the tool you've relied on your entire life might not always respond when you call on it. Imagine stepping into conversations, rehearsals, even ordinary mornings, wondering whether today will be a clear day or a foggy one. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. He still made people laugh. He still showed up. He still performed. But inside, the rules were changing without warning. Anxiety wasn't just emotional anymore. It was chemical, neurological, systemic. His own brain was sending signals he couldn't interpret, let alone control. And this is where the story shifts. Because this isn't a tale about a man who lost hope. It's about a man who was slowly losing clarity while trying desperately to hold on to who he had always been. He sought help. He asked questions. He tried to understand what was happening to him. But some conditions don't announce themselves clearly. They disguise themselves as mood disorders, stress, aging, exhaustion. By the time the truth becomes visible, the damage is already deep. The tragedy isn't that he made the world laugh while feeling sad. The tragedy is that he was fighting an invisible enemy while still trying to protect everyone else from pain. He kept giving comfort even as his own sense of safety collapsed. And when the darkness finally closed in, it didn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked quiet, ordinary, misunderstood. What comes next is not a story about failure. It's a story about what happens when brilliance collides with biology, when fame masks decline, and when the person everyone depends on is the one who needs help the most and can't fully explain why. Long before the stage lights, the awards, and the unstoppable energy, there was a quiet child learning how to survive loneliness with imagination. He grew up surrounded by comfort, but not closeness. His parents worked. Large rooms stayed silent. Toys replaced conversations. And in that silence, something important formed. The ability to invent worlds when the real one felt empty. Imagination became more than play. It became protection. Voices, characters, accents, rapid shifts in personality weren't just entertaining. They were a way to fill space, to feel less alone, to create connection where none existed. When other children learned how to fit in, he learned how to perform. When others learned how to be seen, he learned how to become whoever was needed in the moment. School didn't immediately reward that difference. He was bright but restless, curious but unfocused. He didn't move through life at an average speed. His thoughts raced ahead of everyone else's. Teachers noticed intelligence, but not direction. Peers noticed humor, but not the anxiety beneath it. Even early on, laughter worked like a key. It opened doors, softened judgment, brought acceptance. That lesson stayed with him. As he grew older, performance stopped being a coping mechanism and started becoming an identity. Drama classes didn't just give him structure, they gave him permission. On stage, speed wasn't a flaw. Intensity wasn't strange. Emotion wasn't dangerous. The very traits that made him feel out of place in normal life suddenly became assets. Applause replaced silence. Attention replaced isolation. But there was a hidden trade-off. When a person learns early that being on brings love, it becomes difficult to believe they're worthy of connection when they're quiet. Humor turns into obligation. Energy becomes currency, and rest begins to feel like absence. Even as his talent sharpened, something else grew alongside it. Sensitivity. He absorbed moods. He felt tension quickly and deeply. Joy came fast, but so did sadness. And without a clear emotional off-switch, intensity piled on intensity. Laughter wasn't relief. It was acceleration. By the time he stepped fully into the world of comedy, he wasn't just performing jokes. He was channeling years of stored emotion at high speed. Improvisation suited him because it mirrored his mind. Fast, non-linear, unpredictable. But improvisation also left no space to slow down. No pause, no silence. And silence was where discomfort lived. That's why early success felt both intoxicating and dangerous. Validation arrived in waves, but it never lasted. The moment applause ended, the question returned. Who am I when I'm not entertaining? For someone whose sense of worth was tied to reaction, stillness could feel like failure. This background matters because it explains the pattern that followed him for decades. He didn't use humor to escape sadness. He used it to outrun it. He didn't perform because he loved attention. He performed because attention meant connection, and connection meant safety. Every laugh was proof he still belonged. But the brain that learned to survive this way never learned how to rest. When later struggles appeared, anxiety, addiction, exhaustion, they didn't arrive from nowhere. They grew out of a lifetime of running at full speed without recovery, out of a system trained to respond, not reflect, out of a person who gave energy constantly without learning how to protect it. This is not the story of a broken childhood. It's the story of a mind that adapted brilliantly to loneliness and then paid a long-term price for never slowing down. A personality built for performance, not preservation. And as the years passed, that distinction would become devastating. When his career finally ignited, it didn't build slowly. It exploded. Comedy clubs became laboratories where nothing was fixed and everything was possible. He didn't test jokes. He tested limits. Characters appeared mid-sentence. Voices collided. Thoughts leapt so quickly that even other comedians struggled to keep up. Audiences weren't just watching a performance. They were witnessing a mind operating at full throttle. This was where his gift became undeniable. Improvisation wasn't a technique for him. It was his natural language. While others crafted routines, he surfed instinct. While others paused to breathe, he accelerated. Laughter came in waves, not punchlines, and soon word spread. There was someone new who didn't just tell jokes, he detonated rooms. Television opened the first real door. Suddenly, that chaotic brilliance had a platform big enough to contain it. Fame followed quickly, but something else followed too. Expectation. Now, every appearance required not just humor, but maximum humor. Faster, louder, smarter. The energy that once felt freeing started to harden into a standard he had to meet every time he stepped in front of a camera. Film came next, and with it, a surprising revelation. Beneath the speed and silliness was emotional precision. He could make people laugh, but he could also make them feel safe, understood, seen. When scripts allowed him to slow down, something deeper surfaced. Vulnerability, warmth, sadness without irony. Audiences didn't just accept this version of him, they embraced it. Success stacked on success. Box office hits, critical praise, industry respect. He became one of the rare performers trusted to carry both comedy and heart. But the paradox sharpened. The more beloved he became, the less room there was to falter. The public image solidified into something specific, joyful, generous, endlessly energetic. Deviating from it felt dangerous. Behind the scenes, the pace was punishing. Long shoots, press tours, late nights, early mornings. The same brain that thrived on stimulation now had no escape from it. And when the noise finally stopped, discomfort rushed in. Anxiety didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as restlessness, a feeling that stillness was unsafe. That quiet meant something was wrong. This was when coping mechanisms quietly entered the picture, not out of recklessness, but necessity. Ways to slow down, ways to sleep, ways to briefly silence a mind that never learned how to disengage. From the outside, it looked like excess. From the inside, it felt like survival. Importantly, none of this dimmed his talent. If anything, it made him work harder. He showed up. He delivered. He exceeded expectations. The industry rewarded reliability, not vulnerability. And so the pattern locked in. Give everything. Ask for little. Keep moving. What people often misunderstand about this phase is that there was no visible collapse, no dramatic unraveling, just accumulation, fatigue layered on fatigue, anxiety layered on expectation, identity layered on performance. The system held until it didn't. Because when a career is built on speed, any slowdown feels catastrophic. When your value is measured by reaction, silence feels like rejection. And when your mind is your instrument, the first hint of instability isn't just frightening, it's existential. By the time he reached the height of his powers, he wasn't just famous, he was indispensable to studios, to audiences, to co-workers, to fans who used his work as emotional refuge. But indispensability is a dangerous position. It leaves no room to be fragile. This chapter matters because it shows how the foundation was set, not for tragedy, but for exhaustion, not for failure, but for a system stretched too tight for too long. The warning signs weren't loud. They were subtle, easy to rationalize, easier to ignore. And for years, ignoring them worked until it didn't. At the height of his career, everything looked perfect from the outside. Box office numbers climbed, awards followed. His name alone could sell a film. He had reached the rare tier where studios didn't just want him, they needed him. To audiences, he wasn't merely an actor or a comedian anymore. He was emotional infrastructure. When people needed comfort, hope, or release, they turned to him. And that's where the fracture widened. Because peak fame didn't slow his life down, it accelerated it. More projects meant less recovery. More praise meant higher expectations. Every performance was now compared not to others, but to the best version of himself. And when someone becomes a standard instead of a person, there's no space left to struggle. On screen, he began choosing roles that hinted at something darker. Characters who smiled while hurting. Men who carried sadness behind kindness. Figures who seemed to understand loss in ways comedy alone couldn't express. Audiences called it range. Critics praised his depth. But those performances weren't transformations. They were revelations. Pieces of him were slipping through the cracks of the characters. What made this phase dangerous wasn't failure. It was consistency. He kept delivering. He kept showing up. He kept being brilliant, which meant no one had a reason to stop and ask how much it was costing him. In industries built on momentum, concern only appears when productivity drops. As long as the machine runs, the damage stays invisible. Privately, his relationship with stillness deteriorated further. Silence felt threatening. Rest felt undeserved. Nights stretched long. Sleep became unreliable. Anxiety no longer needed a trigger. It arrived on its own schedule. Some days he felt sharp and connected. Other days he felt disconnected from routines he'd followed for years. These fluctuations were subtle but terrifying because they struck at the core of his identity. For someone whose confidence came from instinct and speed, uncertainty was poison. He began questioning himself in ways he never had before, not creatively, existentially. Was he losing his edge? Was his timing off? Was something wrong with his mind? These weren't dramatic spirals. They were quiet doubts that compounded over time. And because he was known as the strong one, the joyful one, the helper, those doubts had nowhere to go. Fame isolates in a specific way. You're surrounded by people, but rarely met as an equal. Conversations orbit your image. Concern feels professional, not personal. And when your public identity is the man who lifts others up, admitting weakness feels like betrayal, not just of yourself, but of everyone who depends on you. So he adapted. He always had. He leaned into work, into movement, into distraction. He continued giving interviews filled with warmth and humor, continued making sets feel lighter, continued absorbing tension so others didn't have to. From the outside, he looked generous. From the inside, he was running on reserves he couldn't replenish. This is the part of the story that's often misunderstood. People imagine a sudden fall, a dramatic breaking point. But that's not how internal collapse usually works. It's erosion. 1,000 small moments where your body tells you something's wrong, and you answer by pushing harder. During this period, medical explanations remained vague. Symptoms were treated separately: anxiety here, sleep issues there, mood fluctuations somewhere else. No single diagnosis captured the full picture, and without a clear enemy, it's almost impossible to fight effectively. You begin to doubt yourself instead. You wonder if you're weak, if you're failing, if this is just what aging feels like. For a mind trained to control chaos, not understanding what was happening was unbearable. And yet, he kept protecting others from it. Friends recall kindness, co-workers recall generosity, fans recall moments of connection that felt personal, even sacred. That's the cruel irony of peak fame. The better you are at caring for others, the less likely they are to see that you're drowning. Empathy becomes camouflage. Inside, the fracture continued to spread. Not loud enough to alarm, but deep enough to destabilize. Confidence thinned, fear sharpened. The joy that once felt effortless now required effort, and effort, over time, became exhaustion. Still, the world applauded. This section matters because it dismantles the myth that success heals pain. It shows how achievement can delay collapse rather than prevent it, how productivity can mask illness, how brilliance can coexist with profound vulnerability and hide it well. By the time the warning signs became undeniable, they no longer looked like emotional struggle alone. They looked like something more fundamental, something biological, something no amount of talent or willpower could outrun. And that's when the story crosses a line, from pressure into pathology. What made this period unbearable wasn't pain alone. It was uncertainty. By the early 2010s, something was clearly wrong, but nothing fit neatly into place. The symptoms didn't arrive in a straight line. They fluctuated. Some mornings felt almost normal. Others felt disorienting, heavy, wrong in ways he couldn't explain. Anxiety spiked without cause. Confidence vanished mid-thought. Familiar routines suddenly required effort. Sleep fractured into restless fragments. For someone whose entire life depended on instinct and mental precision, this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was terrifying. He did what rational people do when their body begins to betray them. He sought answers. Doctors, specialists, tests, explanations. But the answers came back incomplete, fragmented, sometimes contradictory. Depression, anxiety, Parkinson's-like symptoms, stress, aging. Each label explained something, but none explained everything. The pieces never formed a clear picture. That's the cruelty of neurological illness when it hides in plain sight. It imitates other conditions. It disguises itself as mood, fatigue, fear. And in the process, it convinces the person suffering that the problem might be them, that they're failing somehow, that they should be able to control this, that if they were stronger, calmer, more disciplined, it would stop. For him, this was unbearable. His identity was built on mastery of the mind. He didn't just use his brain. It was his instrument, his livelihood, his refuge. To feel it slipping, even slightly, meant losing trust in the one thing he'd always relied on. Fear entered quietly, then stayed. Not fear of death, fear of confusion, fear of waking up unsure who he'd be that day, fear of being on set and suddenly feeling lost, fear of not recognizing himself. These weren't dramatic episodes. They were subtle shifts that made everyday life feel unstable. And instability, for someone who lived by speed and control, was exhausting. Outwardly, he tried to keep going, not because he was in denial, but because stopping felt worse. Stillness amplified symptoms. Silence magnified doubt. Work, at least, gave structure. It gave him something predictable in a world that no longer felt predictable internally. But the effort required to function kept increasing. Simple decisions became heavy. Confidence no longer arrived automatically. The mental flexibility that once felt infinite now felt fragile. And because the decline wasn't constant, hope kept resetting expectations. Good days convinced him he was fine. Bad days convinced him something was deeply wrong. That emotional whiplash is uniquely destabilizing. It prevents acceptance while intensifying fear. He wasn't hiding. He was searching. The tragedy is that the true diagnosis, Lewy body dementia, would only be confirmed after his death. During his life, it remained an invisible enemy, operating behind symptoms that mimicked other disorders. LBD affects cognition, mood, sleep, movement, and perception. It doesn't just weaken memory, it disrupts identity, and in its early stages, it's notoriously difficult to identify. Imagine experiencing that without a name for it. Without a name, suffering feels personal. It feels like failure. It feels like weakness. You ask yourself why others can cope and you can't. Why rest doesn't restore you. Why medication only partially helps. Why fear keeps returning even when nothing appears wrong. And because he was deeply empathetic, he felt the impact his struggle had on others, on his family, on colleagues, on people who loved him. That awareness added another layer of guilt. I'm supposed to be the strong one, the joyful one, the helper. So he tried to protect them from the truth, from worry, from watching him unravel. He carried fear quietly. He explained symptoms in softer language. He minimized. He hoped clarity would return on its own. But neurological decline doesn't negotiate. As the months passed, his confidence eroded further. The future, once filled with projects and possibilities, began to feel uncertain. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he couldn't trust consistency anymore. And for someone whose joy came from engagement with the world, so a withdrawal felt like erasure. This is the part of the story people struggle with most. They want a single moment, a final cause, a simple explanation. But the reality is far more unsettling. He was fighting something he couldn't see, couldn't name, and couldn't outwork. Willpower didn't help. Talent didn't help. Love didn't cure it. What he needed was clarity, an understanding of what was happening to him. But clarity arrived too late. By the time the truth was known, the battle had already consumed him. This isn't a story about giving up. It's a story about being overwhelmed by a condition that dismantles the very tools needed to fight it. About a man who spent his life translating chaos into joy, and was finally faced with chaos he couldn't translate. And when the mind itself becomes the battlefield, escape isn't always possible. In the final months, life narrowed. Not dramatically, gradually. The world didn't collapse all at once. It grew smaller, heavier, more difficult to navigate. Tasks that once felt automatic now required preparation. Confidence no longer arrived on cue, and the gap between how he was supposed to feel and how he actually felt became impossible to ignore. What hurt most wasn't pain. It was fear without a map. Each morning came with uncertainty. Would his thoughts feel clear today? Would anxiety arrive without warning? Would his body cooperate? This kind of unpredictability erodes a person quietly. It makes planning feel dangerous. It makes hope conditional. And for someone whose joy came from connection and presence, it felt like being slowly pushed behind glass, watching life happen, slightly out of reach. He was not unaware. He was deeply aware. That awareness is important because it reframes the ending. He wasn't detached from reality. He wasn't indifferent to those around him. He understood what was happening enough to be terrified by it, and not enough to explain it clearly. That limbo is one of the cruelest places a mind can exist. Doctors tried to help, treatments were attempted, medications adjusted. But without a correct diagnosis, every intervention felt like guesswork. Some days improved slightly, others worsened. The lack of consistency made trust impossible. Trust in treatment, in prognosis, in the idea that things would stabilize. And throughout it all, he remained gentle with others. Friends describe kindness, gratitude, apologies for being off, moments of humor that felt fragile but sincere. He wasn't withdrawing from love. He was trying to preserve it, trying to keep those around him from carrying fear that he himself could barely manage. The public never saw this version. They saw headlines, projects, appearances, but behind closed doors, the battle was exhausting. Not loud, not theatrical, just relentless. And when the mind becomes a source of threat instead of refuge, rest becomes impossible. The final decision, whatever words people use to describe it, cannot be understood without acknowledging that context. This was not despair born of emptiness. It was fear born of disintegration, the terror of losing oneself piece by piece, the horror of recognizing that the very thing that made life meaningful, his mind, was becoming unreliable. This distinction matters because it moves the conversation away from moral judgment and toward compassion. It recognizes that some illnesses don't just cause sadness. They destabilize perception, safety, and identity. They trap people in a narrowing corridor where options feel increasingly limited. His passing shocked the world because it contradicted the image everyone held. How could someone so joyful, so generous, so loved end this way? But the image was incomplete. The truth was quieter, more complex, and far more human. After his death, the diagnosis finally became clear: Lewy body dementia. The invisible enemy had a name at last, and with that name came understanding. Too late for him, but vital for everyone else. Understanding that brilliance does not protect you from biology. Understanding that laughter is not immunity. Understanding that some battles cannot be won by effort alone. The ending was quiet because the struggle had already consumed all the noise. What remains now is not the moment he left, but the decades he gave, the lives he lifted, the pain he absorbed so others could breathe easier. His legacy isn't defined by how his story ended, but by how many people felt less alone because he existed. And perhaps the final truth is this: the world remembers him for making us laugh, but the deeper lesson is learning how to listen to the people who seem strongest, brightest, and least likely to need help. Because sometimes the ones who save everyone else are the ones silently hoping someone will notice they're drowning. What remains after the applause fades is not the tragedy, but the echo of a man who gave people permission to feel lighter in a world that rarely is. His legacy isn't a list of roles or awards. It's the quiet moments he created for strangers who needed relief and found it in his voice, his timing, his kindness. He taught us that laughter can be medicine, but medicine is not a cure. That joy can be generous, but generosity can drain the giver. And that brilliance, no matter how rare, does not grant immunity from the body or the brain. The danger wasn't that people loved him too much. It's that love often mistook performance for proof of wellness. There is a lesson here we're still learning too slowly. The people who seem strongest are often the most practiced at hiding pain. When someone's gift is to lift others, they may feel obligated to keep lifting long after their strength is gone. We celebrate resilience without asking what it costs. We applaud endurance without checking the damage. His story challenges a comforting myth that success heals wounds. Sometimes it does the opposite. It raises the stakes, narrows the margin for error, and replaces rest with expectation. When admiration becomes dependency, vulnerability feels forbidden. And when vulnerability is forbidden, suffering goes underground. The most important part of his legacy may not be what he made us feel, but what he asks us to do differently now. To listen past the jokes, to treat sudden changes with curiosity instead of judgment, to understand that mental and neurological illness can look like mood, like stress, like aging, until it doesn't. And by then, time matters. If we honor him honestly, we don't romanticize the pain. We respond to it. We build systems that notice decline early, that treat confusion with urgency, that separate identity from productivity. We learn to ask better questions and to accept answers that don't fit neat stories. Because the real tragedy isn't that the funniest man in the world was hurting. It's that our culture still struggles to recognize hurt when it's wrapped in laughter. His work will outlive the silence, not because it distracts us from darkness, but because it reminds us to look at it with compassion, to see the whole person, to understand that joy and suffering can coexist and that acknowledging one does not diminish the other. In the end, his greatest gift wasn't the jokes. It was the humanity beneath them. And if we listen closely enough, that humanity leaves us with a responsibility to notice sooner, to care deeper, and to remember that saving others should never require someone to disappear.